Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome to SUMSA's second Monday lecture. The speaker today will be Dr. Yassir Morsi, and he'll be speaking about Islamophobia and racism. Dr. Yassir Morsi completed his PhD in political science in the University of Melbourne, if I'm correct, yes, and Islamic studies as well. His main area of research is racism and Islamophobia. He looks at the struggles facing Muslim minorities living in a secular and liberal Western society, and in particular, how Muslim communities became politicized. Yassir was the president of the University of Melbourne Islamic Society. He probably doesn't want me to tell you that. He's also just completed his doctorate. Without any further ado.
Thank you. So, Assalamu alaikum. Let me know if you can't hear me. First of all, thank you to SUMSA for inviting me. And thank you for everybody for attending. So the topic, inshallah, today is about Islamophobia and racism, but in particular the relationship and above all a response to a question, is Islamophobia racism? The reason why this question is somewhat important, and not only because we as Muslims living in the West have had to deal with various forms of descriptions about our religion and ourselves, about our aspirations and hopes, and above all our histories and pasts, and often it's been said to have been done generally in an Islamophobic atmosphere. That's not to say that everybody who speaks about Islam or Muslims in Australia are by default Islamophobes, but it is to say that in particular post-September 11 has been a politically charged atmosphere in regards to tensions between Islam in the West, and I was in part invited here to speak tonight at 6 o'clock on the topic of quote-unquote cultural wars. The key word here is war, in the sense of a continual conflict. So that's part of the reason why the question is important, but the other dimension to it is that often Islamophobia is not seen as racism. Racism is most normatively or in mainstream defined as a set of criticisms and discriminations and hatred towards a person's looks, quote-unquote race, biological makeup. Whereas Islamophobia is seen to be a criticism of Islam, a religion, an ideology, a worldview. So can, therefore, Islamophobia be racist? So what I want to do is essentially ask that question, but more than anything introduce the existing conversation around Islamophobia. And, you know, I'll take it a step back because I don't want to turn this into some type of academic discussion or lecture. I'm a Muslim who grew up here, who found my religion in response to that atmosphere that I mentioned. And above all, the reason why I got into academia is to understand partly, I had that naive assumption that secular institutions were going to give me the light bulbs that I needed, but to resolve issues. And I just really want to get a conversation with fellow Muslims about how we experience our citizenry, our religion. And the conversation is heated in many ways because there's plenty of Muslims who may say that Australia is a wonderful country that offers us wonderful opportunity, one of which is to go to the University of Sydney and get an education. And out of this comes debates about there's only a few Muslims who give us a bad name. The majority of us are peaceful. Others may say that it's, you know, we just need to resolve certain issues through harmony days and multicultural debate and dialogue, and so on and so on. So I want to be part of that conversation because I do hold a position, and I have a position against all of this, but above all, I think what's needed for Australian, broadly speaking, but the community on a narrower level, is for us to begin to register and draw an inventory of our own experiences of racism, and to see where they correlate with one another, to see where we can learn from one another, because whatever books I've read and whatever PhD I wrote, at the end of the day, it all came back down to my experiences as an Egyptian, being born in the UK, living in Australia, and having to deal with constant media harassment. Word. But above all, what annoyed me the most, and those of you who know me, wasn't just a harassment by the media, it was community responses. The construction and the almost quasi-delight at the idea that some of us were good Muslims. And this, I want to say, is all part of the racist / Islamophobic narrative. When you present yourself as an exception to the rule. You know, I'm sure some of you have heard the quote before, this and that, you know, he's a doctor, he's an engineer, he's a lawyer. And it's almost always said as if you're an exception to, you know, you've departed from something. And we take great delight in being a departure from the stereotype. And often that creates all types of different results, which are all also part of what I would say is Islamophobic atmosphere. When we begin to divide ourselves in good and bad as according to how the other sees us. Now, to answer my question very quickly before, I might ask you guys questions, but yes, exclamation point, yes, Islamophobia is racism. The people of the argument that say Islam is not a race, you don't know what a race is, because race is a social construct, it's not real. There's no such thing as a uniquely black person or uniquely white person. There are synonyms of power and privilege and position that have been constructed. The indigenous person has probably more genetically in common with those in the southeast region of Asia than they do with Africa and so forth, and white as a skin color kind of. Well, we know Albanian, Bosnians, Turks, Lebanese people are also white-looking. So when we speak about race, we are not speaking about that which is simply observed. We are speaking about a hierarchy where one is privileged over the other, an order that has shaped our modern experiences and relegated the black to the lower end and the white to the top end. In that sense, racism is very, very productive as well as being negative. We know of racism, the negative stuff. We know when people say, X person can't drive, Y person likes watermelon, Z person likes to belong to gangs. We all know that. And instinctively, we also know it's wrong. But racism, as I said, is productive. It has constructed a positive view of what is good. And many race theorists have categorized that construction of the good as whiteness. What we mean by whiteness is not just simply, and should not be reduced to biological skin color. Whiteness means success, achievement, being rational, being wealthy, being able, if you will, to overcome your own historically shaped identities. It means being normal. White here is the departing point. This morning, I've been hanging out with a few brothers in Lakimba in Belmore, which explains why I'm tired. But last night, we were having a barbecue, and the boys were screaming at each other what type of bread to get. And one of them said, let's get Lebanese bread. Another one said, sure, no bro, let's get normal bread. Yeah. And that term, normal bread, what's normal bread? Why isn't Lebanese bread normal? Lebanese bread is a departure. The reason why we add the word Lebanese is because bread is just bread, right? But it's kind of a European type of bread, a Western type of bread. And the point of whiteness is this: it doesn't need labels. When you go to McDonald's, you don't say American food. It's McDonald's. Every other restaurant is labeled. And this labeling works as a form of departure from an assumed norm. When we see somebody wearing a funny hat, we say, look at the man wearing a funny hat. When we see a black man wearing a funny hat, we say, look at the black man wearing a funny hat. Black gets highlighted. Terrorism becomes Islamic terrorism. Criminal acts in the newspaper are often resorted back to the ethnicity of the person who acted upon it. And so whiteness here assumes a sense of norm and success, and if you will, that unnamed, invisible thing. And to give you an example of when I was a kid, growing up in Australia, I remember we used to take great delight, it was a fairly, quote-unquote, multicultural, and I had problems with the term, but that can come to Q&A, but it was a fairly multicultural school, and we used to brag. I used to hang out with the loads of Greeks, Italians, and we used to make fun of the skips, and they would make fun of us, and so forth. And we used to say things about Australians And one of the things we used to say is that they had no culture. That we had culture, they didn't have culture. Yeah. And it was funny because what was our culture? My culture was wearing an oftan, okay. When it came to Eid or Jummah, my culture was the type of exotic food I ate, which wasn't exotic. And if anybody's here is Egyptian, just look it up. The full tameya, yeah. That was exotic. That was my culture. The Greeks had their Easter with the red eggs. That was exotic. That was their culture. The Lebs had their gangs and burning stuff. That was their culture. Right? Yeah. So basically, everything that we highlighted was the stuff that we didn't do day to day. We did in the exceptions. We did in our religious holidays, in our national celebrations. Yeah? And we assumed because they didn't have these departure, these moments of celebrations, other than Christmas, which was for everybody and all that they didn't have a culture. Culture became that exception. The Lebanese and the Lebanese bread. But what's funny is that really all of us participate in Australian culture. The very makeup of the way the school is organised, the TV shows that we were talking about, we would come debate and dispute referee decisions about the football, and even if you didn't know footy, until this day I used to work at the Trove, and I shouldn't say this on camera, but I had this guy who constantly came up to me and say, how'd the Hawks go? And because I was a Hawthorn supporter, I haven't watched the game in 2 years, right? But I had to talk about it. It helped create a bond. So I was like, yeah, that third quarter was amazing. It was all off the charts and stuff. And we would exchange these notions. We participate in all of these unsaid rules on a day-to-day level. The way we go to uni, the way we dress, the way we talk, the way we participate in the social media and the entertainment that we watch. But we don't assume it as such in itself. Well, I didn't at the time, to be culture. It is broadly speaking exactly that. And when we have a dominant culture in such as Australia, where we're the minority, the dominant culture creates certain exceptions for us to practice in other cultural norms. And that's part of the reason why we speak about multiculturalism. There are certain moments where you can culturally practice your own culture, which in itself is a fluid term. But I'm kind of digressing. The point really that needs to be established when we ask the question, yes, is Islamophobia a form of racism, is that racism is productive. It produces stuff. And one of the things it produces is a sense of success. And in many cases, when we speak about famous Muslims in Australia, we're speaking about successful Muslims. And we're speaking about their closeness and their proximity to whites. The proximity to the norm. And that, all I'm saying, whether you agree with it or don't disagree with it, whether you think it's necessary or not necessary, whether you think it's part of our dawah and it's required, okay, that's another debate. For me, I simply want to add, it's part and parcel of the broader discussion about racism. And this, in that point, concluded racism is both the production of the negative, bad, terrorist, wife-beating, oppressed woman Muslim, and the exceptional, roomy, poetic, I love democracy, I recognize my religion has time and place, Muslim, the hijab is my choice, and so forth. Both of these, in many cases, are constructions of a similar conversation that bounce off each other. And I want to make a clear disclaimer here. I'm not saying that if you fall into one of these categories that you are racist, or if you celebrate one of these categories, you're racist. What I want to say is that the conversation about minorities is often framed within the parameters of an existing language which is so often shaped by racism. It's a different distinction. Okay? You are not a racist if you say that the hijab is your choice. But the response to the claim, and often it comes at moments when we need to explain crises or when things go wrong. So I had a friend or an acquaintance, or an acquaintance of a friend, I'm trying to distance myself from this guy, who used to spend hours upon hours eating my ear away with this constant set of narrative and excuses why I'm the ideologue, I'm the crazy guy, because I refuse to understand that Australia is a beautiful, open, liberal, non-racist country, and things like the Indigenous question are things of the past, the colonial heritage are, we can't blame existing white generations for what happened prior, and every cliche I've ever heard all rolled into one person, and he continually badgered me for it. Okay, and he would tell me his principal example was every day when he goes on the bus, people smile at him. And then later, he joined the Liberal Party. My argument against him, no, it's not this person at all. No, stop laughing. Later, he joined the Liberal Party. My argument against him was, that's fine. They smile at you at the bus stop and on the bus. The real trick and test is this. Forget your money at home one day. Hold up a line one day. Yeah. Smell. No, literally smell. Yeah. Sit in the wrong seat. Be loud. Do something wrong. And then get on the bus. Now, of course, when we do wrong and we do things, people don't like it around us. But the point here is this. Often, when we do things wrong, the explanation for why we make an error is often reliant on racism. Yeah. So that is a disadvantage that that quote-unquote white people don't have. When you make an error, it will be reduced down to your skin color, your race, your religion, where you've come from, or the fact that you haven't integrated and properly don't understand the nice and the correct etiquettes of catching a bus. So the point here is to understand that this flu-like racism that is caught by all of us is often caught at moments when your immune system's down, to continue the analogy, or when society's in moments of crisis. So when the economy starts going down and people aren't living their life to their best, migrants are blamed. When there's tension, conflict, and otherwise ethnicity is brought back in to explain the conflict. That's a better way to understand racism rather than counting on your head how many people are racist as opposed to not racist. Anyway, about a year later, the guy calls me back and says, Yassir, you were right. Australia is racist. And I'm like, I wasn't really interested, but I was polite enough to ask why, what happened. And he said during his Liberal Party, every time he tried to, young Liberal, whatever, caucuses, whatever they were doing, I don't know, every time he argued with people, and he was quite obnoxious character in the sense that he always said his truth. Every time he debate with them and he made people dislike him, he would hear whispers by one or two people that he was a Muslim. And he had spent so much time. And it wouldn't be like, oh my God, you're saying that because you're Muslim. It would be in more insidious, subtle, passive-aggressive ways. Your religion would just be brought up, and you're like, why was that brought up? You recognize the person notices it. And to give you an example, I used to do philosophy classes, and we were debating some guy about capitalism and so forth, and out of nowhere he says to me, I was kind of like a bit of a critic about certain areas. Out of nowhere he says to me, but Dubai is capitalist. I didn't bring up where I came from. I didn't bring up my religion. My argument wasn't dependent. If anything, it was quasi-Marxist. He just decides to bring up Dubai. Now, that's what I mean. It's always brought up as some type of, I mean, maybe you've heard it all before, like, I'm a critic of colonialism. And somebody says, but the Ottomans were colonists. Okay, but that's not dependent on my argument. In a sense, you will always reduce and return back to something, to some essential geography about how you are essentially the other. So that is an example of how this notion of racism shouldn't be reduced. And Islamophobia, therefore, is a kind of strand of that, where it's concentrated and looking specifically about Muslims, specifically. Now, I want to conclude because, look, although, wow, that's quick. Final point, be very careful, in my opinion, of what we call certain forms of anti-racism, because they end up being quite equally as racist as anti-racism. Now, I haven't really worked this out in my head as a form of analogy, so it's going to probably collapse in a heap of nonsense, but bear with me. I've said this before elsewhere, but the thing, this is because I'm very consumed by popular culture. It's part of what I do, and I actually have these moments of philosophy when I watch The Simpsons, right? Or I'm eating Cocoa Pops. Okay? It always comes to the most mundane moments. I remember watching The Simpsons, and Bart Simpson was stuck down a well. Somebody seen that, right? And Homer, who's the greatest character on television, had bought him a kind of walkie-talkie radio. Yeah. And he'd given it to Bart, and Bart was playing these pranks on everybody. He'd put one part of the radio, he'd hide it, and from his room he'd make up stories. And so one day what Bart did, he threw one end of his radio down a well, and he created a character called Timothy. And he started saying, "Help, help, I need help. Somebody help me." And the entire Springfield came to this rescue of Timothy, who was stuck down the well. And there was songs, Sting got involved. There was like top charts, everybody was donating charity. Everyone was involved in the industry of saving Timothy. Yeah? Everyone. Okay, there was NGOs, and you see where I'm going with this. NGOs, government forms of intervention, leadership programs, all sorts of Harmony Day, you name it. The whole city came around trying to rescue Timothy. What was interesting, Timothy didn't exist. It was a fiction of Bart. Now, what I want to say about anti-racism in many ways is often the fiction of any organization involved. Every NGO creates Timothy in the way they want Timothy to be rescued. Every organization creates the Muslim in the way they want the Muslim to be rescued. And in many ways, you're not being rescued from racism. What's being rescued is the Australian citizen, the liberal human. Yeah? What's the ideal that they want us to be is being rescued. So I read almost 10 books on Islamophobia, and Islamophobia was often defined as that which denied us human rights, that which denied us democracy, that which denied us citizenry, that which denied us an equality with, as I said, the norm. In a sense, that which denied us whiteness. So Timothy, quote unquote, the Muslim form of the Timothy was constructed in any way. What was interesting to the end of that Simpson episode, Bart actually does fall down, yeah? And then he tells the truth and nobody's interested in rescuing him, yeah? It just has to be up to Homer and a few others to help him out. And that, for me, was a kind of light bulb moment as well. Will the true Muslim, and I don't mean true in the sense of it is more authentic than other, I mean from my orthodox understanding of it, the true Muslim in regards to who brings along with him or her the Sharia, yeah? Will that be rescued? Or in order for us to exit racism, do we have to leave certain parts of our religion behind? Do we have to somehow reshape it in forms that suit, if you will, being rescued out of Islamophobia? I'm going to stop there. Jazakallah khair for everybody for attending. Now, I'll leave it up to Q&A because it's already 1:45.
Yeah, let's do Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Barakallah feekum. So any questions? Sisters? Others? Yes,
So since you said racism is kind of like a hierarchical kind of thing, by extension, would that mean that sexism can also be considered as a type of racism?
Absolutely, it's a very good question. I think patriarchy or sexism and racism are intrinsically tied with one another. The most dominant privilege on the top of the hierarchical chain is white, quote unquote, but it's also white and masculine, the white man. Now, you asked me, is sexism like racism? I make a distinction between the two, but I think they're tied. So I don't think you can fight racism without fighting patriarchy. Definitely. And I've seen people do it. So what you have, for example, is liberal white feminists who want to rescue or liberate Muslim women, but they end up being racist in the process. Yeah? So they end up saying Islam is backward, Arab countries are backward, the Middle East is backward, Asia is backward, and women have to be rescued into a liberal kind of view. And I don't think you can exchange the two. And vice versa. I don't think I've seen Muslim brothers who oppose Western form of racism by asserting patriarchy and misogyny. Yeah, asserting the dominance over women. And I don't think you can distinguish the two. So yes, it's hierarchical, and I've said it in a couple of classes that I've done. At the end of the day, the most privileged identity is neither. It's the white man, and I want to make it clear here that I'm not generalizing, because it's not that I appreciate the criticism that keeps saying white is a skin color, but white man is a place of privilege. And at the lowest the lowest end of that hierarchy, you might say, is the black woman, as an example of what I'm saying. Or the black woman who has no property and no control of her sexuality. So yeah, it's a very important question, and to all the brothers, don't think you can fight racism without fighting patriarchy, including your own and mine. And I'm already married, so I'm not saying that for any other reason.
You know how you're talking about like the vertical dimension, right? And how religion has become in secular society like something that's lowly, or something that's like considered just like recreational, you know what I'm saying?
That's,
Yeah. And stuff like democracy and well, secularism is like something high and liberating for human beings. Like when you talk to like, you know, the general like, you know, Aussie, if you will, like just the general like, you know, secular human being, oftentimes to talk about like religion with them, that sort of hierarchy will appear. And so how can we bring it?
it's a good question. There's two ways to deal with it. The first one is you're absolutely right in one level. People often think that secularism is on a theoretical level, a separation of church and state. It's actually, for me, a relegation of religion to a particular space. Take it 24-hour day. The North sleep 12 hours for us Arabs. Yeah, but 12 hours a day, right? Your 9 to 5 hours are basically the optimum hours that you use to live your life, work, and so forth. And then you have personal time so often that you have to do for other recreational things. What we as a community often do is we go to uni, get our jobs in the 9 to 5 stuff, and we have to find ways to bring our religion into spare time. Very few of us actually have jobs that are aiding, if you will, the establishment of the religion as there. Very few. And so secularism, you're right, is about this hierarchical order where we are reduced. And one of the problems out of that is the sophistication of the arguments and language that were established by the ulama, by our history and tradition, are not as well. Imagine if you had 9 to 5 every day and got paid for it and could create labor out of it by studying the religion, by creating institutes that perpetuate religion, the debate would be completely different. So you're right, what we have is what we call a doxa, prevailing background notion where it's common sense to say things like secularism is better. You don't even have to know what you're talking about. You don't even have to study the two, because one reason, it takes over our day, it organizes we work within it and so forth, and we have very little understanding of our religion beyond a few snippets that we can gain and gather. Yeah. And that ultimately shapes the conversation, and we find ourselves, so many of us find ourselves relying on secular arguments to defend the religion rather than Islamic quote-unquote arguments from centuries worth of built-up knowledge. We just don't have access to it. And so the debate is always skewed. However, the second part of your question is how we overcome it. I'm not a big fan of overcoming it for obvious reasons. And this is my frustration, so I opened it up for you guys to cure me. Often anti-racism is viewed as a way to, I'm going to put it in ways that is less offensive. I was on a discussion panel, there was a very nice lady who lives in North Queensland, put her hand up and said, how can you guys, I'm from North Queensland, and there's all these people who don't know Islam, don't know the religion, don't know Muslims, and they fear us and they're scared of us and so forth. And it's up to us to go there and tell them otherwise. Yeah. Give them dawah. Like you've often heard it, the best form of dawah is smile at somebody, be a nice Muslim. Now the reason why I'm reluctant against this is I don't think anti-racism should be seen as a way to educate the majority about who we are. Anti-racism should be seen as a way to empower a minority and bring them back to their feet. And I think we have limited energy, resources, time and capacity to make change. And so for the idea of us to improve the majority's view of us, I think our energy should go back to bringing people up to a level where they can use their potential. And racism is not just also about ideas, it's about bringing people out of abject forms of poverty and disadvantages that are materialized, and that's where our energy. So yes, I get your question, but I would say use your energy elsewhere. what was interesting about that point is people will be convinced by what you do anyway. So if you all decide to help a group that is less powerful and there's barakah out of it, that's a form of dawah. Run out of time now? Okay. Hard to answer your question, but basically what I'm trying to say in conclusion is it's not our role to be therapists to white anxieties. It's not. Go give dawah to the less needy, including ourselves.
You want to say it?
No.
How do we, you know how you said that to ourselves, we're usually pumped up about, you know, that we see that some people are racist, etc. But when we meet other people, our sort of dialogue changes a lot. How do we change those conversations? How do you think that we can?
Part of it's confidence. Minorities suffer from confidence. We've been led to believe, both physically and spiritually and materially, that we're deficient. Now, you may deny that we are, but the conversation is constantly about our deficiencies. Constantly. And we do have deficiencies. Everyone has deficiencies, but our deficiencies are highlighted as reasons and so forth. And what inevitably we have, is some theorists may say we have, and I'm stretching it here, but some theorists may suggest that we have a double consciousness. The double consciousness, you know who you are, you know where you're coming from, you have your own, but you're also aware, that is to say, of how others see you. So you know what black means, but you also know how white sees black. You know what it means to be Muslim, but you also know how white see Muslim. We know how the West sees Muslims. Some of us, I grew up not knowing what it meant to be Muslim, but I knew very well how the West saw Muslim. And my Islam was actually Orientalist. It was just a construction of the West. I used to get excited about, you know, carpets and camels and stuff, and, you know, pyramids. And I would come back and tell all my mates that the Sahara is beautiful, and sometimes I'd make up a story how I trekked across it. Yeah? They believe me, don't worry. So, yeah, so at one level, how do you change the conversation is that, well, you need certain levels of confidence to be able to say it out loud. What's unfortunate is those of us who have confidence often haven't the language, and we just, I want to be clear here. There's two reactions to this. There's compromise and there's outward rejection. And we either demonize the West or become the West. The ability is to learn to be critical of the West, yeah? Without demonizing it. And that criticality comes from confidence. So how you change the conversation for me at one level, which I have absolutely no expertise in, and I'm slowly learning, is for us to reintegrate ourselves into the 1400-year traditional conversation that's come out of the deen. Just listening to conversations within the Musalla, the disputes, the debate, the vigorous nature of how we're talking about one issue, yeah? What's fascinating? Like, if we continue that conversation, we'll fundamentally integrate into our everydayness. We'll then be able to take that conversation that we have in our mosques, outwardly speaking, to each other and everyone else. But that confidence comes from standing up for yourself. And minorities need to learn how to do that, and they need to know how to do that, as I said, to go back to the same point, by knowing how to respond and be critical to the rest. Because you know, like, if I say Khalafa in my job, it's not that they won't listen. Some of them will nod their head, oh, that's fascinating, that's interesting. Some of them may shake their head, you're a bad Islamist. Either way, the merit of the argument has already been framed by a set of anxieties, yeah? And we know that, intuitively we know that. We know that. If any one of you say, no, in the Quran it says that the woman should be devoutly obedient, you know instantly that that's going to elicit a certain reaction. And some of us say, no, that's our haqq, that's our truth, end of story. And that form of dawah just makes us resilient, yeah? And it doesn't make us grow. And I think what needs to happen is we need to explain the kind of higher objective of it all and the history behind it. And we don't have that confidence yet, because the irony here, let me conclude, sorry for taking up your time, is this is what's brilliant about hegemony of the West. It even teaches us how to be critical of the West. Not only does the West tell us how to see itself, it tells us how to criticize itself. And we need to learn how to establish an Islam that is critical of the West, rather than, which is dominant. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, there's plenty of, mashallah, illuminated black people in our community. But at the moment, the two conversations are either moderate a radical, yeah, and the radical one is simply about demonization. Sorry.
How would we approach, there's already an issue with racism and Islamophobia against Muslims, the minority and how would we approach that within Muslim communities?
Yeah.
That's equally as
Yeah, my wife is Eritrean, and I suffered a lot of questions and racism within Muslim communities. I'm Egyptian. So what happened was, what you found out was that Muslims, I thought should know better, were saying the same things that I was fighting against. I was with my mates yesterday, and it's amazing. They know when Australia is racist towards plebs, Arabs, and then 10 minutes later they're cracking jokes about indigenous people. And they're saying, let's not go to this area because, you know, Abos live there and will get murdered. Like, the transition was incredible for me. And 2 minutes ago, you were telling you were aware of racism, and towards each other. So jokes about being Pakistani, Indian, you know. What I want to say here is, as I said, racism is kind of like a discourse, a flu, if you will, and it can be caught by anyone, and it is caught by everyone, and it is a hierarchy. So, colonially speaking, the Egyptian was seen somewhere between the British and the Sudanese. We can't defeat racism without questioning that hierarchy. It's about the hierarchy. And all I can say is, my conclusion is, yes, racism is everywhere, but no, it's not universal. And what I mean by that is, you can't really be as racist towards white as white can be towards black. Put it this way, the damage done by racism is not distributed equally. If indigenous elders were racist towards the Australian government, it might result in certain speeches, patterns, and so forth. If the Australian government was racist towards indigenous, it would almost lead to the annihilation of their culture. And so racism needs to be under hierarchy and power order, and that's how we should fight it. So I attack the powerful rather than the less powerful, and I'm more interested in white forms of racism than being filtered down within communities. But it's all part of the same problem. Can't distinguish the two. Sorry, Mohammed. Sorry, Assalamu alaikum. Nice meeting you all.
Yassir, thank you very much for coming. Inshallah, right after this, we'll be praying Duha in Jamal. Also at 6 p.m. will be Culture Wars, discussion/debate with Yassir, Maureen Faruqi, and Trevor Khan. Also, Yassir will be coming in tomorrow for an interfaith panel between 2 to 4 p.m. inshallah.